Hi, folks. This is Dr. Rob Sivers here, the Carb Addiction Doc, and this is part of the series that I've done with my wife, Janae, call her the Carb Addiction Mom, about our pregnancy. And I'm here by myself today because, from a medical and a science perspective, I'd like to go through Janae's blood work. As a doctor working in the metabolic space, in the ketogenic space, be it for babies, for children, for unborn babies, and for adults, one of the key things that we look at is this complex interplay of various bits of our blood work, biochemistry, and vitamin levels, and that kind of thing, because they're all critically important. No one number is an isolated abnormal number. All the numbers interplay. So, what I've done over the last 20 years is I've formulated based on two bits of information. Number one, critical, vital measurements. I don't measure everything, but there are critical, vital measurements that tell a story of interaction, tell a story downstream. So I'll explain to you how that works. So for example, if I'm looking at inflammation, I don't need to measure every inflammatory marker. I may do if there's a concern, but I measure a few global markers of inflammation to give me a baseline, and then if needed, we explore inflammation because inflammation is such a critical part of biological health. We also look at certain hormones, certain vitamin levels but these are markers. And I look at all the markers and I look at the interplay, and then we will order additional tests as we need to. It also tells us a story about how well somebody is doing from a dietary perspective. So as we go through this, I will share that information with you. So my selection of which tests to do is based on markers, not a global thing, to be able to markers that are good enough to tell me the complex story of what we can affect. And then there are certain tests that I would like to get, like a coronary artery calcium score. But I can't get that easily because this is America. And hopefully over time, those tests will become as easy as some of the crazy tests that we now do. But that's kind of where we're going down. And then the third part about getting all of this blood work to understand is that anytime you look at blood work, there is the absolute number, and then over here they give you what they call normal tables. Now, what's the normal range? And what we've got to understand about normal range is the normal range is created based on testing, let's say 100,000 people, seeing what the standard deviation range is, and using that standard deviation on the bell curve of those numbers to define normal. The problem with a standard deviation normal table is that it is based in large part when we're doing metabolic type work, it's based on the diet of those people. And these normal tables were mostly created or refined by the different laboratories based on a standard American diet. So I'll just give you a very simple type of thing. A normal blood pressure, an acceptable normal blood pressure for most adults is 120/80. As I'm sitting here right now, my blood pressure is somewhere just below 110/60. Okay, so what's the issue there? Well, the 120/80 is a normal blood pressure, so-called normal blood pressure, for someone on a standard American high carbohydrate diet. When you don't eat carbohydrates and you're mostly on a high fat diet, that blood pressure automatically drops down with a normal of 110/60. If my blood pressure was consistently 120/80, I'd actually be on the borderline of hypertension. So we've got to understand those metrics, and when we look at these numbers, I've created my own normal tables that I use as parameters to define health on a low-carb, high-fat diet. And then the other place where I use this blood work is because you can be in ketosis. You can drink a gallon or a bottle of olive oil and get yourself into ketosis. That doesn't mean that the biochemical machinery of your body has become fat adapted, has been adapted to using ketones. So it takes at minimum 3 to 4 months to begin to be fat adapted. And a lot of these numbers, my own normal tables that I have a range for in my head, are based not on ketosis, not on not eating carbohydrates, but are based on someone who has done that for a long enough period that they are fat adapted. So they're going to be way off the standard American normal diet tables. And these are the metrics that we've used over the last 20 years to define the healthiest way of life. They're not perfect, but they are the lowest risk of metabolic disease. So we'll go through that and I'll give you my numbers as we go, but that's the basic rationale. So as we got blood work on Janae when she was 20 weeks pregnant, so this is halfway through a pregnancy, and we have blood work to compare it to. By the way, over the last 20 years, we've done over 30,000 of these panels. So I have tremendous experience, because you can't read about this in a textbook. You cannot read about this in any peer-reviewed papers. But this is a 20-year experience with over 30,000 tests done, knowing and being able to see what people are on a fat-adapted ketogenic diet, what people are entering ketosis, and what people are diabetic or high insulin producers. That's how we've evolved our story. It's based on this data. But guess what? This data is so left field because my patients are typically not eating the standard American diet that the standard American doctor has no use for my numbers. So I can't get this work published anywhere, which is a travesty. We'll talk about it another day. But let's go. So the first thing I've got in front of me is Janae's complete blood count, CBC. And the first number I look at as a global marker of inflammation, of course, there's a number of different pressures on this, so it's a perception, not an absolute, is a white blood count. Now, my ideal for white blood count is to have a white blood count at 5 or less. Okay, the range is 3.4 to 10.8, but typically when a healthy, non-sick person comes in and is on a fat-adapted ketogenic diet, ideally I'd like to see their white count 5 to 6 or lower. That's kind of the ideal number, which tells me there's not a lot of inflammation going on. And Janae's at 6.5, which is absolutely fine for me. I'd like that to drift down a little bit lower, but she's fine right there. The next number I look at is the hemoglobin, because that's the oxygen carrying capacity of the bloodstream, and I'll connect hemoglobin with A1C and a few other things. And my ideal hemoglobin is 11.5 to 12 or above, depending on who you are. Remember, in pregnancy, your hemoglobin, your blood counts are diluted because of the volume in your bloodstream, and she's in a perfectly good range at 11.8. I then look at the structure of the red blood cells, the MCV, the MCH, MCHC, which tell me about iron. Hemoglobin does as well. It tells me about iron stores and iron. It tells me about folate. It tells me about B12. It tells me about the B vitamins that all go into the production of healthy hemoglobin and red blood cells. And all her numbers are normal. I also look at the platelet count, 239, which is well within my normal range. And I cannot tell if those platelets are activated or not, but by virtue of the white count, they're not. Activated platelets, this is my Ph.D., activated platelets and a dropping or a lower platelet count is one of the quintessential elements of intravascular coagulation, intravascular injury, damage to blood vessels. And the commonest causes of damage to blood vessels is sugar and nicotine. And then I look at the absolute numbers and the percentages, and they're all absolutely fine, including the neutrophil percentage and the neutrophil numbers, which are absolutely fine. So the next parameters that I look at is I look at the CMP, the complete metabolic panel. And the first number I look at there is the blood glucose. Now the range for glucose should be around 70 to 99 or 65 to 99. On a CGM, my average blood sugar is between 65 and 75. And by the way, I always like to get my blood work fasting and first thing in the morning. And the reason for that is not because it's better or worse or anything like that. It's just for the consistency. So I can compare my vast experience of looking at 30,000 plus patients worth of blood work. I can compare that if it's done for the most part at the same time. So I do look at the time of the day when this blood work is done. And given the fact that there should be a morning effect or a dawn effect that most diabetics are aware of, Janae's blood sugar is 71, which is phenomenal. That's nice and low, which tells me that if this is early morning and it's that low, she's fat adapted. In other words, cortisol will always create a surge of sugar and the surge is higher if you're insulin resistant and your cells are still using sugar. The less your sugar use sugar, the less your cells use sugar, the more ketogenic you are in a fat adapted biology, the lower that dawn effect is. That's why diabetics have these massive dawn effects. And at 71, she's in great shape. The next thing I look at is a creatinine. BUN I also look at, but it's fine. The creatinine number I like to be below 0.7. Well within the normal range of 0.57 to 1, but at 0.7 it tells me that there's no significant renal damage, at least to the flow of blood to her kidneys. And she's at 0.63, which is great. One of the very interesting things that when I talk to people about salt, eat as much salt as you want to, your body knows how to handle salt, is this, that when I look at sodium on a blood work, the sodium range is always extremely tight, typically between 138 and 142, and the entire body is geared toward maintaining your blood salt level, your blood sodium level in that very tight range, because salt is so critically important for blood volume and blood pressure maintenance. So many pathways of the human body are driven to keeping your sodium at that number, whether you are sodium deficient or sodium excessive. If you have excessive sodium, you can sweat it out, you can pee it out, but most importantly, you poop it out. When you're sodium deficient, your kidneys in particular, and your sweat and your colon sucks that salt up, and you exchange it for magnesium, calcium, potassium, the other cations. And that's why a lot of people are magnesium deficient, because they don't have enough salt on board. So the sodium almost never varies. And yet the other molecule that keeps volume in your bloodstream, which is glucose, can vary widely. You can have a blood sugar of 40, you can have a blood sugar of 400. Massive changes, and every molecule of sugar is attached to a molecule of water. So little shifts dramatically affect the volume of fluid in your bloodstream and in your interstitial space. And yet sodium, which is really biologically the most important element of blood vascular volume control, is always in a very tight range. Makes you think, doesn't it? But her sodium is 138, absolutely fine. Now, the potassium, the chloride, those things are all fine. The next number I look at, particularly in a pregnant woman, is calcium. And calcium is critically important for bone growth for a baby. However, the most important supply of calcium is actually a woman's bones. Her bones are her calcium bank, and that's why it's so important for people up to the age of about 25 to put calcium into their bone bank, because after about 25 years of age, that bone bank becomes a supplier, not a net absorber of calcium, and you don't want to tap into your retirement. So I look at the calcium, and I saw here 8.1, and it's called low. It is below a non-pregnant standard of 8.7 and 10.2. Oh my God, the calcium's low. But the normal range for a pregnant woman is about 8.2 to 9. So Janae is right at the lower limit of that level of that limit. So a little bit worried. Am I too concerned? No, because I know she's got strong bones and that those bones will be a source of calcium. But in order to add supplementation to the calcium, even on a carnivore diet, she should be getting plenty of calcium in. What do? She's drinking a glass of whole milk with a little bit of cream every day to increase the fat content, but really to get the calcium. Instead of taking some calcium supplement, she's increasing that in whole milk, and we'll recheck that in a little while, but I'm just not worried about that. Typically, with the dilution that happens intravascularly, your total protein and your albumin in a pregnant state drop down a little bit. So even though Janae is on a high carnivore diet, which is protein protected by fat, her albumin is slightly low at 3.4 and her protein is slightly low at 5.3 relative to a non-pregnant normal woman. But we know that she's consuming massive amounts of protein. So what's happening here? Well, that protein is diluted in the bloodstream, but also being shifted to the baby and its stores. I'm just not worried about that because I know what she's eating and drinking. And her globulin ratio is normal. It's well into the normal range. And globulin is the protein that binds to and attaches to so many of the molecules that move around the bloodstream. Her bilirubin is fantastic. And here's the next number we look at is in order to have an intact metabolism, your liver really needs to be working well. And part of that is bile production. So total bilirubin, her unconjugated, conjugated, complete and normal. Total bilirubin is below 0.2. And remember, that bile is critically important to absorbing fat into your body. And we know she's absorbing tons, so the bile production is absolutely fine. Her ALK-Phos, alkaline phosphatase, which is a marker of inflammation of the liver and so common in people that have fatty liver, is at 37. It's low. Oh my God, it's low. No, that's healthy. And her AST and ALT, which are enzymes that leak out of the liver cells into the bloodstream when those liver cells get damaged, is super low. It's at 13 and 10. So that means that her liver is about as healthy as it can be. It's functioning absolutely fine. And the liver cells, the hepatocytes, are doing well, and she does not have fatty liver. She does not have fatty liver syndrome. So that is a beautiful number over there. I can do a deeper dive into her liver function, but that gives me enough. The other number I look at for liver function is her PT and PDT, because that's the enzymatic production from the liver, those pathways. And both her PT, PDT are slightly on the low side of the normal range, which is perfect. That tells me she's in clotting balance. And I'm very, very pleased with that. So next we look at the urine. And everything looks absolutely fine. Her urine is not overly concentrated despite the fact that she's fasted. Specific gravity we look at there is 1.017, which is normal for a pregnant woman. When she's not pregnant, she runs in the 0.025 to 30, highly concentrated urine, which is normal for mammal species. If you look at your dog almost always has concentrated pee. But because of the volume dilution of the urine, I expect her specific gravity to be about between 1.015 and 1.20, and she's right in the middle of that. pH, the color, everything else is normal, and no protein spilled in the urine, which is another critical thing we look at in pregnancy. Is there any sugar? Is there any protein in the urine? Those are clearly markers of renal damage and of preeclampsia or hypertension during pregnancy. Proteinuria is a bad thing in pregnancy, as is an elevated spill of sugar into the bloodstream. She's negative for both of those, and here's the key thing. The only abnormality on her urine, oh my God, her ketones are at 2+, which tells me she's in adequate ketosis. She's in fat-adapted ketosis. I know that from what she eats and drinks, but her ketones are 2+. And the bizarre thing is, these normal tables say it's abnormal, and I put in words there, great. So she's absolutely fine in that regard, and that proves that she's in ketosis. Now, let's look at the lipid panel. Oh my God, the lipid panel. This is going to be awful. She needs to be on a statin. Her total cholesterol is 252. I will let her doctor have the heart attack on our behalf because she ain't going to have a heart attack. That 252, which is the total cholesterol, which is a totally irrelevant number because it's so-called good plus bad cholesterol, whatever the hell that means. Why are you taking DHA? Why are you taking fatty acids? You're taking that fat to support your baby's brain, and then when the fat in your bloodstream goes up because you're transporting fat, now they tell you it's dangerous and you're going to have a heart attack and a stroke. Bullshit. Okay? So total cholesterol we completely ignore. The most important two numbers for me are HDL and triglycerides. Her HDL level is at 80. Now I use as a metric HDL above 75 is what I like to see on a ketogenic diet, which is correlated with a low cardiovascular risk, a low risk of vascular inflammation. HDL for her is 80, which is fantastic. And then the alarm bells go off because her triglyceride count is 130. Ideally, I want that below 75. So, oh my God, why is her triglyceride count that high, especially if she's eating a ketogenic diet and we know she's in ketosis? The reason it's that high is because she's transporting massive amounts of fat soluble in her bloodstream for the baby. She's taking in pill forms of fat. So I have no issue with that triglyceride count. Ideally, I'd like to see it a little lower, but the explanation for that elevated triglyceride count is the fat that she's transporting free in her bloodstream attached to globulins, and that's the DHA and the EPA and the short fatty acid chains. the palmitic acid, the oleic acid, the linoleic acid that's being transported free as a triglyceride. Now, why is triglyceride such a problem? Because under normal circumstances, triglycerides that float free in the bloodstream are a marker of vascular injury. Why are they a mark? They're not a mark. They don't cause injury, which the lipid doctors love to tell you. But when you convert sugar to fat, the way that fat, that is the product of sugar, gets transported in the human bloodstream is in free triglycerides. So normally somebody on a standard American diet, one of the greatest markers of vascular injury is a high triglyceride count. So I always worry when I see a high triglyceride count. At the same time, the most important marker of health for me, of a healthy intact vasculature, is a triglyceride count without the use of medication below 75. So when Janae comes in at 130, those red flags go up. But none of the other markers, her blood sugar, remember, was 71. Her ketones are positive. She's 2+ positive in ketosis. And we'll see as we go through this, some of the other biological markers are all correct. So while that triglyceride count may be a red flag when all the other numbers are bad, particularly with her, it's just a testament to the fact that she's transporting healthy fat through the placenta to the baby. And I'm hoping that the baby's brain is going to be bigger than mine. Okay, so let's look at the one that most doctors look at, which is this awful, horrible, you're going to drop dead in a second number, LDL cholesterol. Now, her LDL number is a calculated, it's LDL-C, which is the standard way we measure it, and her LDL molecules are either big, fluffy, safe molecules called LDL-A or awesome, or tiny little molecules called LDL-B, B for bad, because they're empty of triglycerides. Now, we know that she's transporting some triglycerides in her bloodstream, but the overwhelming likelihood with high HDL is that the LDL calculated number is mostly A particles. We could fractionate that, and maybe the next time we test her blood work, I will fractionate that to prove this. But all the other metrics, all the other complex metrics point to the fact that her LDL-C is most likely the A particles, the large fluffy particles, which are healthy particles transporting fat back and forth, rather than the B particles, which are markers of damage. And her LDL level is 146. Now, any doctor ever seeing that LDL level is immediately going to write a prescription for a statin. And it's the single worst thing you can do, because my baby, our baby's brain needs fat. And how the hell are you going to get fat to the baby's brain if you destroy the molecule that carries fat from your liver and from your fat cells to the placenta? So statins are a terrible thing. Statins are a terrible thing to put anybody on, let alone pregnant mothers, because you need that fat delivery system to the baby's brain and to the baby's body. Now, if your LDL is elevated, you want to know why. And if you're on the standard American diet, get away from the damn standard American diet. That's the way to fix your LDL. But if you're eating a lot of fat, if you're on a low-carb, high-fat diet, of course you want your LDL up. And I like a range of 120 to 200 on average for my LDL. And she's at 146, and I'm totally happy with that. And her risk of a heart attack is close to zero. Her risk of intravascular coagulation is also close to zero, because all the inflammatory markers that we've looked at so far are very, very green zone or safe. Okay, so the next number that I'm going to look at is her direct bilirubin, which is 0.05. Again, a marker of liver health, absolutely fine. Her thyroid hormone, okay? Let's look at the thyroid. The thyroid is part of metabolic rate, it's part of metabolism, and her TSH, which is the trigger for thyroid hormone release, is a 2.25, slap bang in the middle of the normal range. We know that she does not have too much negative or positive feedback, that because this is a negative feedback loop, her TSH is exactly where it should be. And her thyroid, her T4 level is at 6.4, slap bang in the middle of the range. Now, the problem is that the T3 number is the most important number in terms of active thyroid. And her T3 uptake is at 18%, which is low. And her free thyroxine index, which is the T4 index, is at 1.2, lower limit of normal. Why? Why is that there? And again, those are normal numbers when someone is pregnant. Because of the changed, sped up metabolic rate that pregnant women undergo, that whole cycle. So if you just look at one number, most doctors would look at that T3 number and put her on thyroid medication. No, you've got to understand the process. And her thyroid numbers are absolutely fine for a woman who's pregnant, whose metabolic rate is healthy. I have no issue with those numbers. So most doctors look at the number and treat the number. You want to understand the biologic process. We will keep an eye on that thyroid. What's the one thing she can do in order to help her with making sure that there's no issue? The salt that we use in our diet, and we use abundant amounts of salt. We use pure sodium chloride. We use mine salt, which includes salts of magnesium, potassium, calcium, and we also mix iodized salt into our salt mixture. So we make sure there's enough iodine substrate for her thyroid to function normally. What's the other substrate? It's an amino acid called tyrosine. And in someone who's got a low insulin level and abundant tyrosine as part of the protein, as part of the muscles of animals that you eat, and adequate iodine, unless there is a at least there's another autoimmune reason to have problems with your thyroid, that thyroid production is absolutely normal, and it is created by a healthy TSH. So no worries there, and completely fine in pregnancy. So next, we look at the folate and the red cell folate, which is critical. Why is folate important? Remember, we talked about the baby's brain development, spinal development. Folate is related. Folate deficiency, which is very common, is related to spinal defects, spina bifida being the worst of those, but spinal developmental defects, defects in the brain, in the brain development, defects in the nerve development, defects in the development of the spinal cord. In fact, the group of people that have the highest incidence of spinal cord deficient babies are women who did not take folate supplementation, and in particular, people that have had a gastric bypass or a duodenal switch, which are metabolic diseases of metabolic loss, and they often don't have enough folate, and if they get pregnant, they have a very high incidence of spina bifida babies. And as a segue, at Vanderbilt, we used to cover baby spines in utero to cover the defect of spina bifida, which is a consequence of folate deficiency. Her folate is through the roof. It's 599, 1650 is the red cell folate, absolutely fine. And we know on ultrasound that our baby's spinal cord is fine. So the folate is good. The next numbers we're going to look at are the diabetes numbers. And these are critical as an interplay because insulin resistance governs all of metabolism. And the most important number for me is actually the insulin and the C-peptide, but they also govern over long term the hemoglobin A1C. And Janae's hemoglobin A1C is 4.9. 4.9. My range in a ketogenic fat adapted person is 4.8 to 5.2. Upper limit of normal is 5.6. Diabetes is at 6.5. And most Americans live between 5.5 and 6.5, which is already where that chronically elevated blood sugar is damaging their hemoglobin, which is what hemoglobin A1C is. And by the way, people that are increasingly susceptible to bad outcomes from COVID have a high glycosylated hemoglobin ratio as well. So at 4.9, we know that any diabesogenic effects are absent and that the risk of gestational diabetes is zero. So why the hell do a glucose tolerance test, which is an awful test to pregnant women, if you can just check the A1C and check the blood sugars? It is an archaic thing to subject every pregnant woman to a glucose tolerance test to figure out if they have gestational diabetes. And then when they have gestational diabetes, you put them on a medication. You don't tell them to get rid of the carbohydrates. Just a bizarre, archaic way that obstetricians work. Okay. Now, we did do an LH and an FSH just to make sure those are 0 and those are below 3. She should not have any hormonal production outside of the ovaries and outside of the placenta and the baby. So we look at DHEA, and it is at 157, which is absolutely fine. And the next number I look at is testosterone. Testosterone is one of the numbers before pregnancy that governs polycystic ovarian syndrome. Yes, testosterone in a female. And oh my God, Janae's testosterone level is at 60. The upper limit of normal is 48. How can it be that high? Well, the normal range in pregnancy in the second trimester is 37 to 347. So she's absolutely fine right there. And one of the key things about testosterone, it tells us kind of what sex the baby's going to be. Okay, now, together with the hemoglobin A1C, we look at two numbers. We look at the C-peptide, which is the precursor of insulin produced from the pancreas, and then that C-peptide molecule gets cleaved away. And the ideal C-peptide for me in a ketogenic diet is below 1. Most people have a C-peptide between 2 and 4, which tells me they're profoundly insulin resistant. This is your marker of insulin resistance, and Janae is at 1.3, and an insulin number, her insulin, ideally I like below 4.6, her insulin is at 4.4. Those numbers tell me that she is profoundly insulin sensitive, which is about as healthy as you can be. And then in addition, because she has bad reflux and because she's had some stomach issues, I checked an H. pylori test, which was negative, which is great. And then we look at some of the standard vitamins and irons. Well, her iron count is 72, her vitamin B12 is 464, her magnesium level is great, and her vitamin D level is great. Part of that's from her diet, part of it is from the prenatal vitamin, but her numbers are absolutely perfect. We also looked at serum ferritin, we looked at transferrin, all of which are absolutely fine, and her glucagon is low at 33, which tells me that despite her low blood sugar, and this is critically important, how do you know when someone is just in ketosis, or how do you know when they're actually fat adapted? And the glucagon number will tell you that, as will the insulin sensitivity. But here's the point. If her glucagon is low, but her blood sugar is only 71, and this is an early morning blood sugar, surely glucagon and cortisol should be getting the liver to kick out sugar if the cells of her body needed huge amounts of sugar. But if her blood sugar is only 71, her insulin and C-peptide are low, her glucagon number is low, that tells me that there is no demand for huge amounts of sugar in her body. Oh my God, then what she's living on? We know that her keto number is 2+. We know that her triglycerides and her LDL is elevated. Janae is fat-adapted keto. So the cells of her body prefer to use fat or ketone bodies rather than sugar. Of course, her blood sugar needs to be there for certain cells that have to use sugar. And I'm sure that if she went for a run or hit her cortisol button, that she'd have a surge of sugar, which happens naturally. That's kind of the nitrous in the racing car that your body needs. But at rest in the early morning, she doesn't need a lot of sugar. Her glucagon level is low. Her C-peptide and insulin level are low, so those two are controlling her glucagon because insulin actually controls glucagon. Her cortisol is not having a huge effect on that sugar, and she's in fat-adapted ketosis, which is about as perfect as I could want it to be. So I know this has been a long video, I know this has been a long story, but every time, if ever you come into my practice as a patient, that's what goes through my head every time I check your blood work. And the reason we get that series of blood work is because I can tell so much about inflammation, about some of the risks to your body, about what body dynamics you are. And even if you're on a ketogenic diet, how effective is that diet in terms of correcting your own biochemistry? And by the way, I can't be absolute about this, but this blood work is the single best thing Janae could have done to reduce the risk of disease severity should she get COVID. And as we know from some of the New York work, many, many, many pregnant women are testing positive for COVID. And we want our baby and for Janae to be as healthy as we can be. If she does get exposed, ideally she won't get exposed, but the reality is we're likely all to get exposed. That set of blood work has reduced her insulin sensitivity, has reduced her insulin resistance, has made her insulin sensitive. And insulin sensitivity and metabolic health is your single best weapon to having a healthy immune system to be able to deal with COVID as soon as you get it and keep it at the boundaries where our immune system should be working, not after it's already in our bloodstream, after it's already caused us a lot of harm. We'll talk more about insulin sensitivity and COVID in a little bit, but that blood work is the single best thing she could have done to protect herself should she get the disease. I hope this helps. Please write me, please ask questions, but this is what I do every time I ask you as a patient of mine to get blood work. Thank you.